Hi, I'm Angella Mackey, and I'm a researcher at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences and also TU Eindhoven here in the Wearable Senses Lab. And I'm here today to talk about the paper Alternative Presence for Dynamic Fabric, which is sort of like a bird's eye view of my research over the past few years on dynamic fabric. And probably the first two questions that come to mind are, what is an alternative present and what is dynamic fabric? And I'm not going to answer those two questions right away because the paper is actually deliberately interrogating both of those things. So this research is heavily weighted in a research through design tradition, combining strategies from speculative design and first-person autobiographical design to create the form of dynamic, color-changing fabric that I discuss in this paper. And alternative presence is actually a framing derived from speculative design that me and my co-authors have used to answer the bigger question of this research, which is, what is dynamic fabric? And from here, I think the best way to understand all of this is for me to briefly describe the two case studies that inspired this inquiry in the first place. Both case studies acted as alternative presence, which as a term for us very accurately held the tension that existed throughout this research for whether or not I was working with something real or not real in terms of it being a fabric. The first study is called Green Screen Dress. And at the beginning of my PhD, I was interested in exploring what would it be like to wear dynamic color-changing fabric. And some of my references for this come from wearables discourse. So things like the Philips Bubel dress that would change color according to a wearer's mood, Valérie Lamontagne's work Peau d'Âne that depicted dynamic weather patterns and star constellations on dresses, Joanna Berzowska's body of work exploring surface-changing garments and fabrics, and also Linda Vorbeen's explorations of dynamic textile patterns. And of course, there's several examples of surface and color-changing garments from fashion shows, movies, and musical performances. So what I wanted to do for my research was to kind of take this idea of dynamic fabric as I understood it and bring it out of this kind of prototype stage or novelty stage as it is in popular media. And what I wanted to do was explore it from this everyday experience and try to understand what would it be like to wear this kind of fabric on a moment-to-moment basis. What would it be like if I had this kind of fabric in my clothing, in my wardrobe. And at the time, I didn't have a piece of fabric like this. I didn't have a garment that changed color that I could just put in my wardrobe and start wearing it. So I had to find a way to mimic the dynamic fabric. And what I came up with was to use a chroma key app with green fabric as a way to wear color-changing fabrics. And soon after discovering this, I started wearing green fabric in conjunction with the chroma key app every day to see what it would be like to have this ability. And I didn't wear it just for a few days or for a week. I actually wore green clothing and used this chroma key app every day for a year from February 2016 to February 2017.
As a bread.
And there's a more detailed description of this experience that can be read in the paper. Using autoethnographic methods, I documented and analyzed the experience, gathering several insights. But what's important to this paper is that at the end of the year, I had a drastically different idea of what dynamic fabric was compared to where I started. And this is where in the paper we discuss how this mixing of research through design with first-person and autobiographical design, and also strategies from speculative design, that we had created this blurry space that we call an alternative present, which is inspired by James Auger's use of the term. So on the one hand, I was engaging in this speculative act by deliberately wearing and working with something that I thought was kind of akin to a future fabric. But at the same time, what I was experiencing was very real to me, and thus the term an alternative present. And so to go back to what I said earlier about having this different understanding of dynamic fabric before and after the study, in the beginning, when I assumed I was mimicking the dynamic fabric using the green screen, I would have described the dynamic fabric then as a textile that changes color using embedded electronics. And in the paper, this is essentially what we write as the first proposition of dynamic fabric, with more detail, of course. But after the green screen dress study, I would have said, no, that's not what I experienced. It was something very different from that. It wasn't a textile embedded with electronics, but I did wear it, and it did change patterns, and it did function to me as a kind of clothing. Which leads to proposition 2 in the research, where I describe the dynamic fabric as a social technical system of textiles that interact with augmented reality and other digital media to change the surface of a fabric. And so if we compare the two understandings, the initial one describes dynamic fabric as a physical thing, so relying heavily on its technical description and what it can do. But the second understanding, or proposition, concentrates more on how I experienced it, which was more than a digital artifact, but something that also became socially and personally expressive for me using digital enhancements. In terms of wearables discourse, this raises the question of where the boundaries lie for something to be considered a wearable. Can augmented reality or mixed reality technologies qualify as a wearable? So the second part of this research describes a different study called Fem, which ultimately leads to a third proposition in the paper, or another understanding of dynamic fabric. So for the Fem study, I wanted to explore a different perspective. So instead of acting as the wearer, like in green screen dress, I acted as the designer, asking what would it be like to design garments with dynamic fabric. And so I made up a brand concept called Fem, and I used the same chroma key system. I designed several garments, and then I shot a fashion film with a group of very talented collaborators. And so doing this, I essentially gained another understanding of dynamic fabric after reflecting on making the film, which becomes the third proposition. And it's again much different than the original technology-embedded, color-changing fabric concept. For Fem, I experienced it instead as a material state that blends physical textiles with uniquely digital phenomena. So to summarize, this paper describes a changed understanding of dynamic fabric as it occurred for me over several years, before, during, and after these two case studies. And each proposition gives a new way of looking at dynamic color-changing fabrics in general, which could potentially lead designers and developers in completely different directions for future designs.